Good evening, everyone. Hello. The last visit with Sarah in Chicago was here at the MCA, and it was just after the publication of 7 Days in the Art World, which was named one of the best books of the year by the New York Times. So 33 Artists in 3 Acts is just come out and is a terrific read. So I wanted to ask Sarah whether she thinks it is an exciting time to be an artist.
I think it is, actually. I think it's a very tough time to be an artist, but also an exciting time to be one. One of the things I find so fascinating is that there are so many answers to the question, what is an artist, and so many ways to customize the role. I don't think you could find another role that could be an umbrella for such a diverse range of activities. And I think, the question of inequality is a really difficult one. The art has always been about excellence, always been about quality, and often art historically, and the art world is very hierarchical, and it's perhaps hard to imagine a completely flat stratification in the art world, or certainly amongst artists. That doesn't mean perhaps that the disparities we now see are something that should be encouraged either.
Moving from 7 Days in the Art World to 33 Artists in 3 Acts, can you tell a bit about how that overview, the sort of ethnographic overview of 7 Days, led you to these kind of key questions about what is an artist, which is the premise of this book, really, that kind of quest to unveil what that might mean?
I asked the question, what is an artist, in the context of Chapter 2 of 7 Days in the Art World, the crit. And I felt like I only really scratched the surface, and I was kind of laughed out of town, really. A senior curator with a teaching post in LA said something like, when I said, what is an artist? He said, well, you know when you see one. So of course my question was, well, what did they look like then? So I do describe people's physical appearance and sartorial choices. We live in the visual art world. A lot of these choices are strategic or unconsciously embracing myths related to being an artist, or expressing alliances with collectors or alliances with workers or whatever. So when I finished 7 Days in the Art World, there were really 2 things I wanted to understand more. One was the art market, and the other was artists. So I wrote a lot for The Economist, and for 4 years I was their chief writer on contemporary art, and after 4 years I kind of exhausted not my interest in the art market, because I actually still find it fascinating, but I exhausted my interest in writing about it. That coincided with the moment, no surprise, I guess not a coincidence, when I wanted to sit down and start writing this book. I started researching it in the summer of 2009. And then after 3 years, I'd interviewed 100 artists, and at that point I sat down and thought, okay, so what could this book look like? And the structure of it emerged out of my kind of wading through the transcripts. And that's when I discovered that these themes of politics, kinship, and craft seemed relevant to the definition of what an artist is, because it took the notion of an artist to its kind of borders. Someone with, like Ai Weiwei, people would ask, well, is he an artist or is he a politician? Is he an artist or an activist? Or someone else, are they an artist or are they just like a didactic illustrator? Those are one of those are the value judgments you find when you start probing into this role. Similarly with, craft, are you an artist or a craftsman? Or often someone gets slagged off for being a designer. Oh, he's just a designer of, And then kinship, again, in a kind of different way. I think gender is very relevant to the way women artists have been able to command or not command credibility and authority. That's a very generational issue, but being female, being a wife, being a mother, all of these things have historically affected women's right to declare themselves artists, or ability, or self-confidence, self-belief even. It's amazing. I was recently looking at data that the majority of people who graduate from art schools with art degrees are female. But then, lo and behold, and I wish I could remember the exact figures. But then, a year later, the percentage of those graduates who have declared themselves an artist has reversed, and there are more men who've felt confident to declare themselves an artist.
In the book, there's this incredible narrative that weaves through on Laurie Simmons, who really, her story of her various subjectivities. She's the mother of Lena Dunham, and there's just great how she's at one point an artist and a mother, and the mother of someone who becomes better known as the book progresses. So it's a kind of interesting insight into her struggles or questions around subjectivity. It's I think, great. I was going to ask you a question about the 3 acts, which you mentioned, politics, kinship, and craft, as the rubrics of the book. And there's a fabulous quote from you where you say politics, kinship, and craft are rubrics that you might find shaping a classical anthropological tone. They're not typical of art criticism or art history, but through research I discovered that they demarcate the ideological border that differentiates artists from non-artists, or real artists from unimpressive ones.
Real in quotation marks.
Real in quotation.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask, one is, can you talk a bit more about the process, and also talk about how some artists arrived to be in the book and others not so much in the book?
Yeah. My ambition for the book was that it would actually be more than a series of profiles, and that there would be, I wanted to compare and contrast artists and have them talking about each other, and certainly in the kinship part of the book have networks of connection. So in terms of who, in the end I interviewed 130 artists. There are actually only 29 in the book. My alibi on that is that Gertrude Stein wrote a libretto called 4 Saints in 3 Acts, and there are actually 20 saints in the libretto. So I thought, homage to Gertrude. And kind of trying to sail on the coattails of her poetic license. So the book is both cast and curated. It's curated insofar as it was very important that the artists make work that was relevant, not just to me, but I think to our times, and also to the themes that I'd decided would structure the book. And then it's cast insofar as I have some slippery characters who say things you might not believe, and I have some taciturn people who maybe don't like giving interviews, but Cindy Sherman doesn't love giving interviews. Jeff Koons notoriously, perfecting Warholian artifice, but I couldn't have a whole book like that. So the book is biased towards those who were not just articulate, but interested in my questions and willing to collaborate with me on these questions. And, so there are some really remarkable and important and famous artists on the cutting room floor. And I do give an example in the introduction. When one of my favorite artists, I asked him, what is an artist? And he said, an artist makes art. I almost I don't like his work quite as much as I used to, but he just didn't want to play ball with me. He kind of, I felt actually was quite trapped in a discourse that he'd kind of embarked on in the late 70s, and he was kind of a little bit stuck in terms of his way of talking about his work and his way of his rules to himself about being an artist, actually. One of which was don't talk about those kinds of things.
No, I was going to say that it was 4 years of study, 4 years of research.
Right. It depends how you count the years. 4.5 years.
And Hurricane Sandy hit, and in the chapter Ai Weiwei is imprisoned and then released. A number of things happen in the book unfold in terms of the political, economic, social context for these artists. Can you talk a bit about the relationship between artists and their lives and how you felt that was really important to kind of putting the book together?
Mm-hmm. My definition of the work differs a little bit from art critics' definition of an artist's work. For me, an artist's work is everything they do. It's very much a sociological definition. And so life and art start to merge, or life and art in the strict sense start to merge. And I try to follow them through like everything to do with their working lives. So, conversations with curators, collectors doing studio visits, installing during the show, discussions about the ad that's going to go in art form, whatever it is, and not just that which is contained by a frame. And so I do get into some more personal things, especially in the kinship section with regard to the Dunham-Simmons family in particular, because, wonderfully they were very open with me, didn't mind arguing with each other in front of me. That's Carol Dunham and Laurie Simmons in particular I'm thinking of. And I was really interested in artists' belief in themselves. I think that when Duchamp gave artists the godlike right to designate something as art, he put artists in a very difficult position. How do you command that authority? To do that is actually a real shift. And I don't think it's any accident that Duchamp started experimenting with his persona, cross-dressing as Rose C'est la Vie, putting himself in Most Wanted Man posters. And he started crafting identities at the same time as crafting ideas. And so one of the theses in the book is that being, ironically, with conceptual art, being an artist becomes the craft. So with Tip and Laurie, in particular, I get into personal matters, but, mostly my rule is I don't want to see their bedrooms, Yeah.
You go through the cupboards.
Oh, I did go through some cupboards, though. And I did see a few bedrooms, partly because Mauricio Catalan's work desk is in his bedroom. And I did see, and it was a real joy, actually, to see Cindy Sherman's closets, because they're full. It's just like a fantasy, like a young girl's dress-up fantasy going into her studio. There's costumes and makeup and prosthetic boobs and noses, and it's fabulous. So, and and I do venture into people's homes and describe them, but I do, my generation is different to the youth of today, and I do have a boundary where I don't like invading people's privacy. And also, having done my PhD on dance clubs and raves, I swore to myself after that I would never do research after dark. And so I do try to clock off around supper time. So if somebody gets very drunk in the wee hours, my notebook's put away.
You talk, it is interesting, because especially the moment where there's a moment where you're in Maurizio Catalan's apartment, and he's explaining to you that he has this nomadic lifestyle, that he lives like a student, he's got a mattress on the floor, and this is the way it needs to be, so I can just pack up and move. But in that same act, that's the act on kinship, and that's where you have this traditional unit of the Simmons-Dunham family. And I'm curious about Grace.
Yeah.
She is, in the book, it's exclusively visual artists.
For 5 people.
5 people.
So just to clarify, so there's Lena Dunham and Grace Dunham.
Yeah.
And my alibi for their inclusion is the fact that I was asking their parents, Tip and Lori, about how they weathered the storm of their self-esteem, how they weathered competition, what it was like when one of them was being celebrated and the other was having a difficult time in the studio. It was very hard, actually, for me to find an artist couple who'd experienced comparable levels of recognition. And I actually I interviewed some couples, and one couple didn't want to be interviewed together, another couple didn't want to be interviewed apart. Tip and Lori were very together, apart, and open about it. So when Lena, their daughter, who was just at the beginning of the book, a graduate of Oberlin, working on this film, and I didn't really pay too much notice, except, the girls are always present, and when they're not there, the phone's ringing, and, I got the sense of both Tip and Lori being very hands-on parents. So when she gets shot out of a cannon and gets an HBO contract and wins a Golden Globe, it actually does affect her parents and their public selves. And all of a sudden, Lori's talking to me, it's a bit strange trying to navigate being Lena Dunham's mom, Prior to that, she'd been known as Laurie Simmons, the artist. So my alibi for including and then I actually, Grace gave me such a great, I often interview outside the box. I'll interview dealers and collectors about their artists. I want to get it's classic ethnographic method, And so I interviewed Grace. The interview was so good. Her perspective on being the child of artists growing up in Brooklyn was so lucid. I decided, actually, interestingly, to include her before I decided to include Lena. And then I included them both. And then I include Massimiliano Gioni and Francesco Bonomi, who are Catalan's brothers in crime. And then I also include Jack Mankowski, who kind of stands in for the artist in the third part of the book, saying things I need someone to say.
And he's curating a show at the Tate at that moment.
Exactly. So. Pop Life, which is a show which both Damien Hirst and my own Auntie Hirst, Andrea Fraser, are both included in.
I think for me, the Grace Dunham, though, was the fact that out of everyone, there was, except for her parents, a lack of connection, or she wasn't working in the field.
True.
But she has this incredible perspective where she draws this analysis. She says, well, for me, there are artists and makers. There are artists who occupy the art historical progression and makers who don't negotiate that. She said it's a value judgment that has more to do with context than the act of making art. And I'm just wondering whether you agree with that, how you feel about that. I think for me it was a kind of moment of clarity, wisdom from a very young person. Yeah.
No, I think the social context that our artists inhabit and circulate in is incredibly important. Just taking, for example, the category of outsider art, which leads me to talk about the professional artists who work in the art world as insider artists. There are different rules in those two worlds, different values, different criteria of judgment. Often what gets valued in outsider art is the authentic self-expression of the artist. And that's something that is actually poo-pooed in the conceptual art world, where, it's supposed to be mediated by intellectual ideas and a great knowledge of art history. And, it's interesting the extent to which insider artists collect and like the work of outsider artists, almost in a nostalgic way, because they're working within the rubrics of modernism or pre-modernism, and conceptual art is moved into a different terrain. The whole notion of craft is very different within contemporary art. We expect our contemporary artists to be ideas people. They may execute the work themselves, but they may not. Craft, the execution of the work is incredibly important, so they may have, they may deploy the best craftsmen they possibly can to make the work. But the authenticity is not in their hand in the way that there were in previous eras an assumption of a kind of unmediated flow of identity right out through the brush.
The chapter, there's a moment where you introduce Damien Hirst, and he's in his house in Devon, and he's got this shack, I'm going to put that in parentheses, in his back, and he's beginning to paint again after kind of years of having the work created by others outside. And so that's an interesting, I think you introduce the problematic of the term craft. And there's a great quote from Gabriela Rusco who says, "Indeed, handling one's market, making decisions about how much art to make and where to show it, is part of the craft of being an artist." And that act, that final act, really unpicks that notion of what craft possibly might mean to contemporary artists.
And you know what, actually, I said that in response.
You said that.
Yes, I did. I was just looking earlier, and I thought, because she sent me some questions early on through, and I was thinking, that doesn't sound like a Roscoe. I'll tell you what a Roscoe said, though, because I had a moment to look just before coming. He said, "The artist is not in his bubble in the studio, rejecting all the forces of the market in a capitalist society. This is a romantic view. It is just not realistic." And then I editorialized because and the thing that clued me in was the craft of being an artist is so much my argument and thesis. Anyway, yeah, I mean, it's not often acknowledged that an artist's relationship to the market and attitudes towards editioning, to who they choose as their dealer, to the way they navigate all the expectations around collectors and auction houses and all that kind of thing is part of their craft. But my definition of craft is all the skills you need to be a contemporary artist today. And so, when after long, 3 hours of interview, I'll often get into this terrain, and almost all the artists that I can think of, especially those with higher degrees of recognition, end up agreeing with me. It takes up a lot of their time. They have to be strategic about it. They don't want to show with the wrong people. It's all about endorsement and alliance. The reputation management is a huge part of their job, and I think actually that is perhaps excluded from most art school curriculums, and might even be a taboo in some. And that, I think, is unfortunate for young artists today who kind of, and actually even older artists who may feel ignored, who may feel they haven't had the attention they deserve. And of course, that's the majority. And so it's worth acknowledging this and kind of putting it on the table.
Did your understanding
the playing field
of the art world and the art market change through the 4 years of investigation, or did you know it all, really?
No, you know what? I have learned a lot about the art. I learned a lot about the art market, researching the art market simultaneously to writing this book. But I also learned a lot about seasoned artists' views of the market. And I think there's a myth in our culture that the artists are victims of the market. And obviously there are moments when they don't control their market, which feel pretty painful, and you may feel like a victim, but I would say they're making decisions every day that have some agency. And hopefully they're in a position to make those decisions. Like hopefully they're in a position, let's say, to decide between working with this dealer and that dealer. But once they're at that stage, a lot of them can have huge agency with regard to their market. And Hirst and Koons are perhaps the most conspicuous, but in small ways and different ways, they're all playing that game, and it's a very serious game.
I have one more question, and then we're going to open it to the floor. And I'm hoping, this is from Martha Rossler. Her question, you ask about how the American public perceives artists. She says they're interested in artists as celebrities, so you have to ask yourself, what are the characteristics that produce a celebrity? Somebody who has special mojo. She says an artist celebrity is like a fetish object. You love them and hate them. You want to abuse them, but you also worship them. I just think it's such a good quote. After spending so much time with the kind of some of the most well-recognized contemporary artists, Rossler's quote, does it resonate with you?
Yes, absolutely, it does very much. I mean, I think that, we all love to loathe celebrity culture for good reason, because it's really gross and irritating when people seem to be famous for no good reason at all. They haven't achieved anything. They just, have been in the right place at the right time. But I think, celebrity is kind of one thing. Then there's recognition and there's fame, which I see as kind of parallel things. Fame is something you achieve often through work. It's a kind of recognition is something you have within amongst your peers, and then when it goes outside to a more general audience, it can become fame. I think recognition is something that everybody in the art world is seeking. It's a very profound, deep-seated need that you have from childhood. You want to be recognized as doing something good by your mom or your dad. It's that, and then and one needs that through life too. And I think perhaps artists need it more than others. They're driven by it. And so it's a very complicated thing. I think that the art world has its own versions of fame, and when I was working on my PhD on dance clubs and raves, which was an assessment of music culture, I looked very much at the differences between artists who were considered authentic and those who were seen to sell out. And I did a lot of research into the discourses around art and commerce, which is obviously relevant in the art world. But what I decided at the end of the day, that selling out was basically selling to outsiders. And so that music and that artist would no longer distinguish the taste of the person who was the fan. And I do think there is a little bit of that dynamic within the art world. It's a art world's a very complex place. There's degrees of being inside, and there are inner sanctums of the art world that will disown artists as they become too popular. My aunt likes this artist, it's no good for me anymore, or whatever. Yeah, so that's kind of a long-winded digression around that quote.
Good one, though. We'd love to open it to the floor. I hope we've given you... Oh, there's a question just right here in the front.
Thank you so much. During an interview with Fiametta Rocco, right here, with The Economist, you were talking about ego, and you said something that kind of struck me. You said, they're not outsider artists, the ones that you have picked, who are kind of crazy with self-belief. Do you think this is the prevailing, attitude toward outsider artists? And do you think that outsider artists can become insider artists?
Well, I think it's interesting. Insider artists can become outsider artists too, in a way. I mean, Yayoi Kusama is in the book, and her studio is, basically across the street from the asylum in which she's lived in since 1975. And it is very interesting to look at the progression of her work because, nowadays she's making work that really looks like outsider art. In its kind of flow of figuration and free associational qualities. I think outsider art has its conventions, actually. And I was being a little, flip on the spot of that video interview, I think, to talk about crazy with self-belief. I think she was asking me very much about, are artists egotists? And I was trying to react against that in a way. Self-belief is absolutely essential, actually, and self-belief and hard work, I'd put it like the core of being an artist who can maintain a long-standing career in some way. But the key thing is it needs to be grounded. And when it becomes delusional, they can alienate their supporters. Key curators or even their own dealers are like, okay, we're not doing another show with so-and-so or whatever. And also the other thing is the self-belief is usually in tandem with external benchmarks that are endorsing, or benchmarks of validation. And I'm really interested in when an artist feels confident declaring themselves an artist, because quite often you graduate from art school, it doesn't come automatically. And so I always ask that question, and I can actually read you a quick passage where, which I find particularly interesting, because Elmgreen and Dragset are an artistic duo who see themselves as both half an artist, but then have very divergent attitudes to the term. And Inger here talks about when he felt confident enough to declare himself an artist. Do you mind if I read 2 paragraphs, just to give you a flavor? So Elmgreen says, "I don't have the taste in my mouth or the smell in my nose of being an artist. I'm a cultural producer." Dragset actually looks very irritated at him, like, oh my God. And then he says, well, I'm an artist. I wouldn't call myself anything else, just as I'm gay and I wouldn't call myself queer. I remember very well making the decision to accept myself as an artist. I had my 30th birthday in New York City, where we had a residency. Up until that point, I'd felt embarrassed. Then I thought, fuck it, I can be an artist just as much as anyone else. The residency, the studio, the inclusion within a museum show, getting a dealer, first sale of an artwork, all those things, are reality checks that make it important. What I found too is, an artist can be keen to declare themselves an artist, but even their parents don't believe they're an artist. It's a social identity. It's not just internal. And then just to continue, because Elmgreen is being mischievous and with his artistic partner Dragset, Elmgreen replies, "These identity groups are so last century. You were a gay artist in the 20th century. I would also say that we are far too busy to be artists. We make artworks, do a theatrical performance, publish a book, design a t-shirt, curate a show, so many things. We're like small mice avoiding being trapped or cornered. Our work is not about universal truths. All we do is tell small lies."
Are there, or is there a characteristic or several characteristics that you would say these are core to everyone I met? Self-belief, is one that you...
Well, I'm really interested in when artists, when their self-belief cracks. I think you might have seen this picture of Damien Hirst flicking past where he's in his underwear with a paintbrush. And I think when Damien kind of tried to start painting like Francis Bacon, and as he put it in his own words, Rembrandt, that was a crisis of belief in a Duchampian mode of making work. And actually a crisis of belief in ready-mades, a crisis in belief in everything he'd ever done. It's the only way I can explain it, really, because those paintings were so terrible.
Haven't gotten any better, have they either?
Well, he admitted to me that he was kind of shocked at how bad he was when he returned to painting, having not painted since the age of 16. But the analogy that always came to mind, because Damien and I are exactly the same age, is that, me, age 42, deciding, I'm going to be a ballet dancer. It's like, there are certain things you can't take up late in life or midlife or whatever. I think too, Maurizio Catalan, there are different, each act starts in summer 2009 and runs through to the time of writing, end of 2012 or 2013, and there are these trajectories, these narratives. And the contrast to Lena being shot out of a cannon is Maurizio Catalan deciding to retire. And I think that had to do with a crisis of belief as well, or maybe not a crisis of belief, but like exhaustion from the need to keep up his artistic authority and credibility, and actually in a way just wanting to do something fun and creative, like do a magazine like Toilet Paper, and to operate in a critical mode in relationship to fashion. But he felt like in order to do that, he actually had to retire from being an artist, which is a kind of sub-theme that flickers through the book because is the relationship between fashion and art. And there's one of my favorite quotes, which I might have even said on this stage when Michael Darling interviewed me a few years ago, because I'd done the interview at that point, although I was far from actually having written this up. Marina Abramovich distinguishes between her high self and her low self. And her high self is her performing self, but what the hell is the low self, I was wondering. And she said, well, your low self, you can be ashamed of your low self. And then I was like, really? Like, tell me. And she said, well, I've always loved fashion, and in the 1970s that made you a bad artist, which is a very interesting situation where, a love of cars and strip bars has never really been a detriment to a male artist's credibility, but fashion, oh my God, and I wonder if that's not, part of his shift. So I don't know, I'm still pondering it, whether there's one thing that all these people have in common, but I think there are definitely clusters of things they have in common. And one is something that Andrea Fraser brings up, which is artists have fantasies of omnipotence. And I love this idea because partly it's so Duchampian, isn't it? Having the godlike power to designate something as art, who's that going to appeal to? Someone who's got fantasies of omnipotence, right? And she goes back, she's well read in psychoanalysis, and she talks about Freud and Winnicott, and tells me and the readers about how basically Winnicott believes that infants think they've created the world. And it comes as a great narcissistic insult the moment when they realize they didn't. And artists kind of cling on to that infantile fantasy. And actually, kind of when you're, can be the lord of your own work, when you can act out, your supremacy in the universe of your own work, that there you can see it's not even analogous. Actually, it's kind of almost real.
Catalan talks about when he retires, he talks about that idea, now I can reinvent myself.
Yeah.
Now I can be something I'm currently not in the art world, which is a kind of contradiction in terms, because we think of the art world as being this place that you can imagine and do and be as creative as possible.
I think the art world, it's true. I mean, it is a very creative place, but there are also rules. And it's hard to break your own rules in your 50s. It's really, really tough. And mid-career is a very tough time. Yeah.
Sarah, I wondered if you could return to that idea of, or this myth of artists possibly being victims of the art market, and wondered if in your research you came across any of these young artists whose markets have turned overnight and have been thrust into the spotlight, and even if you've been able to witness sort of a more tragic arc where that happens, and then what are they left with at the end?
Yeah. I actually did not include the emergent artists in this book. I was really interested to have broad geographical comparisons, like comparing Eugenio Dittborn in Chile with Ai Weiwei in China, and I did not find I could do that if I also had a really wide-ranging age demographic. So the average, the mean year of birth of the artists in this book is 1960. So, and it's partly too because of the questions I was interested in for this book. The artists who'd had 20 years experience being an artist gave me better, more interesting answers. And having done my PhD on youth, I felt like emergent artists was like a separate book. I couldn't do justice to them, including them here, and I felt it would have been, it wouldn't have really worked. So there are several generations in the book, but most of my artists are born in the 50s and 60s, with like Yayoi Kusama as an outlier. It was important to me to include artists who don't make a living from their work, and so there's 4 artists in the book, one and 2 in Act 2 and 1 each in Act 1 and 3 who teach, and one who doesn't teach but has a kind of day job that doesn't consume her mind too much so she can think about her work. And I was interested to have the kind of range of artists, it's very hard to be representative, but I wanted to capture some of the diversity in the field, and so, academics to entertainers, altruists to narcissists, collaborators versus loners. There's some of those axes amongst the artists in the book, but no real young'uns. Maybe that's the next one.
So maybe you can tell more about link between activist and artist, and I just give small example because China and Russia, two oppressive society. So you talk about Wenwei, however, in Russia, it's Pavel Pavlensky, very famous artist, who famous by 3 acts. First, he sealed his lips in Red Square, represent that there is no freedom of something. Then he nailed his balls to Red Square and sit there naked for a while. And third, recently, like 2 weeks ago, on the roof of the mental asylum, where he was few times taken to analyze, he cut part of his ear like Van Gogh. And now my question really is, so clearly this activist activity only could be in some kind of oppressive societies. You not hear about American artists like Jeff Koons would not be protest against anything, right? So maybe, I don't know, did you hear about Pavel Pavlensky or not? Just comment in generally or link about these 2 activities.
I haven't done too much research in Russia, but I am very interested in the relationship between art and politics and artists, sense of ethics and politics and that kind of thing. I think that in oppressive regimes that are either not democracies at all or false democracies without freedom of speech, that it is often the case that artists can get away with a little bit more than people who are labeled as activists. And I think this definitely helped Ai Weiwei get out of prison and definitely helped him go into prison later than everyone thought he might go in. And we talk about that, him and I. With other regimes, the artist role was not a protection. So with Eugenio Dittborn, who came of age during the reign of Pinochet in Chile, there were a lot of artists amongst the disappeared. And to the extent that that became a theme in his work. And tragically for him, he, amongst other important disappeared people, for Ditborn was his psychotherapist. And it also impacted on his strategies as an artist, because he created these airmail paintings that he would send out of the country as a way of having an artistic life. So I mean, I think there are artist activists in America, actually. A lot of them working on, social, it's usually called social practice, and they're working on a community level very often. Also because of the kind of global ambitions of the book and my cross-cultural comparisons, I don't actually have an artist like that in here.
What is the name, for example?
Well, Suzanne Lacey runs a whole program out at Otis, and there are kind of like lots of graduates coming up through her and that social practice MFA. I think it's
not that I want to do a plug, but there is actually a conference this weekend called Lived Practice at the School of Art Institute that's been organized by the Sullivan Gallery. So there's a whole focus and an exhibition on about social practice in Chicago. So
good.
We have time for probably one more question.
It's a softball question. Many of us went to see a play called Red, and just your comment, you actually met Mark, and just how did that play portray him? And just a quick question.
Mark Rothko? Well, I don't think that's a softball question, because I haven't seen the play, and I was 5 years old when Mark died, so.
What did you think of the play? What were your thoughts?
No, the play itself is a wonderful play about an artist's compulsion or carrying away with his art. And every time I see a painting by him, I look at it and I think about how wonderful he was, and also how engaged in what he was doing and how he drove his associates and his colleagues to extremes in their work. And I bet you that anybody else that saw it has a different opinion of it.
Are you interested in kind of whether Sarah noted that in the artists she met, or just a kind of analogy between the book and the play as forms of representation in terms of contemporary art?
Yes.
I think the Rothko myth is a very powerful myth, and I'm very interested in artistic myths. Art requires myths, but then myths go out of date and no longer seem to hold water. And it's interesting that Rothko's myth is very powerful, and we believe in it in retrospect, but that it's very hard for a young artist to enliven and embody that myth in a way that's credible. One of the things I'm always looking for when I'm, and one of the things I ask all my artists is, what kind of artist are you? And the range of responses is quite spectacular. And, and I'll just give you a few examples. When I asked Wengeshi Mutu, well, interestingly, in Wengeshi Mutu's mother tongue, which is, she's a Brooklyn-based artist who originally from Kenya, and her mother tongue is Kikuyu, there is no word for artist. The closest is magician. Or magician, and I love this, a person who imbues objects with meaning and power, which is a great definition of a ready-made. Anyway, so then I ask her, so toward, we talk about, it being a foreign import and da-da-da-da. So I ask her, what kind of artist are you? She says, well, I guess I would be a tattletale. I'm the one telling the family secrets. And which is particularly appealing to me, because that's what I feel my role is. So, often the roles that have credence are maybe less grandiose than they were in the past. and those kind of grand master narratives of virility and creativity. I mean, Koons does do that, and he's got 8 kids to back it up. You know, but they're not really in the mainstream anymore, I would say.
Before I thank everyone, I had one question that I was going to follow up with Sarah on. You mentioned earlier about when you asked your favorite artist. The answer he gave was not so riveting. So I have a question for you, and it follows on from your question. Out of everyone you met, is there someone who answered what is an artist or what kind of artist are you, the most inspiring answer?
Well, I mean, I guess she's the one one of the ones I identify with. Just, you know, my role within the art world. But I love so many of them, really. I mean, when I asked Ai Weiwei, what is an artist, and here's a man who gives 3 interviews a day and is never at a loss for words, he actually couldn't answer me. And he started telling the story of his father, who had trained as a painter, but then when he was put in prison the first time by the Chiang Kai-shek government, he had no access to materials and became a poet. And then later fell afoul of the Maoist government and was exiled to the remote provinces of China to clean latrines for 18 years, which is where Ai Weiwei grew up with him. And, you know, so Ai Weiwei told me this very elaborate, moving story about his father as an enemy of the state. So I then, you know, put to him, so you've told me this story, does that mean you think an artist is the enemy of the state? And he thought, and he said, I think an artist is an enemy of general sensibilities. Which is a you know, very romantic avant-garde notion of what an artist is, and one that's actually kind of hard to hold in America nowadays, but when you're in a country like China without any freedom of speech, it's there for you to have.
I want to thank CHF. I want to thank MCA, and of course, Sarah.